Bill Paxton, you get to live out the dreams of all little boys. I'm sure as you were growing up, you loved to play cowboys and war and all those sorts of things, and you get to be Sam Houston in Texas Rising.
You know, once in a blue moon, you get to play somebody you really wish you could be. And I really got to do that playing Sam Houston. He was a man for all seasons and a real man's man. Had great ethics, great integrity, great sense of humor, uh, a great character.
As you were working on your preparations for this and your research, and of course you have the great script there, what did you learn about him that you didn't already know? You're from Texas, so I'm sure you knew a few things.
Well, I knew a lot about him growing up in Texas, and you know, I got to go on kind of a great trip where I kind of traced his life from the end of his life in Huntsville, Texas. That were his. There was a little it was a Shakespearean volume of 4 Shakespeare's comedies he kept in his saddlebag, and then I went from there, and I went to Chattanooga, and I went up to Hiwassee Island, and that was something that really fascinated me about Sam Houston. He was a guy who his dad was a Revolutionary War veteran, and then ended up a major in the militia. They were farming, but the dad would be off on military. He lost his dad when he was 14. One of his dad's great legacies to him was a library that he had, which was a pretty good library in Lexington, Virginia at that time. And he imparted a great knowledge of books and a desire to read, which Houston loved all the classics. He particularly loved the Iliad and the Odyssey. He lost his dad at 14. And then the family, his mother, Elizabeth Paxton Houston, moved the family out to Maryville near Knoxville, Tennessee. And they were farmers, but Sam Houston didn't like farming at all. So this was something I found very curious that I knew about it, but I didn't know a lot about it. And I researched it for the role. He went and lived with the Cherokee Indians on this little Hiwassee Island in the confluence of the Tennessee and the Hiwassee River above Chattanooga for about 2 years. So here he was, a young man, idealistic, his head full of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and there he is living in a completely socialistic life, a communal life, a really, for all intents and purposes, a utopia. People living and eating and working and hunting together there. And I think that instilled a great sense of humanity and a sense of fair play. At the end of his life, he was quoted as saying that no red man had ever gone against his word to him, but his own people had done so all his life. So these were things that they weren't going to be depicted or dramatized in the miniseries, but just where I went out with some rangers. We took a barge and some ATVs, and we spent the afternoon. They showed me where there were Indian burial mounds, and it was just kind of cool to walk on this island that nobody gets to go on except these sandhill cranes, and kind of walk the same land and think about him on that river as a young man.
You mentioned the Indians. One of my favorite scenes in the whole project is when you make Brendan Fraser's character come along with you up that little hill there, and you face off against the Indians there. I think it was a chief.
Yeah, the Raven, and Brendan Fraser says, "I don't think Shakespeare translates into Comanche."
Yeah, I love those kinds of scenes. Tell me on a man like this, a man like Sam Houston, there's been other obviously leaders like what I'm about to say, but when people like that go against the grain, everybody, and not everybody, several people in his outfit, several people think he's not being smart about this whole situation, yet he knows internally inside what's the right approach and what's the wrong approach.
he got at age 20, he went into the War of 1812 and went in as a private. He could have gone in as an officer because of his dad. His brothers chided him about this, but he said, "Don't worry, you'll hear of me." In the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, he came to Andrew Jackson's attention. He was almost critically wounded, but he survived that, and he really wanted to make the military his life's career. But when he went up to Washington with a delegation of Cherokee Indians after the war, he was working for Jackson, doing some work with the Indians. He went into John C. as the Secretary of War, dressed in Cherokee garb with a whole contingent of Cherokee chiefs. For the meeting, they walked out the door, and he said, one moment, Lieutenant." And Houston stayed in Calhoun's office, and Calhoun just proceeded to just tear him to shreds. "How dare you disgrace this office, coming in like this?" It left such a bad taste in Houston's mouth that he resigned his commission, and he started studying law, and then that's how he got into politics. So by the time we find him in 1836, and he's the head of the Texas Army, which really isn't an army at all, it's volunteers, he realizes he's up against, a very capable foe, General Santa Anna. He's a combat, experience. He's got soldiers with artillery. Well, so he knows that if he has any chance, he might have one shot, and he's going to have to pick the battle. But I think he realized he had to keep his own counsel. But one nice thing that's depicted in the piece is the relationship between him and Death Smith, who's kind of considered the original Texas Ranger. He was the captain of his scouts, and they were kind of Houston's elite guard. And there's a wonderful relationship I have with Jeffrey Dean Morgan in this piece. I think it's more of a love story between me and him than me and the Yellow Rose of Texas. But I think that he had good counsel with Deef, and they were very close. But he was able to keep his own counsel, and keep his head, knowing that they had a chance to go out there honored and decimated. There was just nothing to be won there. It's also interesting to note that but he would not take the Confederate States of America oath of allegiance. So he was thrown out of office at the end of his life. This was a man who really could stand by his principles and stand by his own counsel. Again, a giant.
You mentioned Jeffrey Dean Morgan. This whole cast, I mean, this has got to be one of the best overall large ensembles you've ever worked with.
Do here. Hang on, I don't know what happened there.
Oh, okay. It froze up for a moment on my end too. I just said you mentioned Jeffrey Dean Morgan. This has got to be one of the largest and best cast you've ever worked with.
Jeffrey Dean Morgan, Olivier Martinez, Ray Liotta, Chris McDonald. God, there's so many great actors in this piece. Reese Coiro. All these actors, some that I knew very well, and others, Brendan Fraser, and others I didn't know. I knew guys like Jeremy Davies I'd worked, but it was an incredible town of Durango, Mexico, where John Wayne and sent films, and it felt kind of like us staying at the Gobernador Hotel. And it was quite a summer. I was there from mid-May to mid-October of last year.
That does not sound like a place you would want to be in the summer. I'm sure that was the heat was much like it is here. It's pretty rough.
It's a nice climate. It's kind of their monsoon season. So these big towers would go up in the day, these big thunderheads, and then it would rain and kind of cool things off. I don't think we would have survived had we shot it in Texas. And also going down to Mexico, like we did for Hatfield and McCoy's going over to Romania. It's just something about going to the old country kind of added the authenticity.
Well, I'm glad you
Not
mentioned
to-
that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, not to mention, I am going to mention, the government did a phenomenal job in recreating that whole world. I had a reservation because on some of these miniseries, you read them and, it says the Battle of San Jacinto, and there's hundreds of men on horseback and fighting and all the cannons going off, and you're thinking, what's that really going to look like? Or they have the budget, the production value to pull that off? And I have to say, Roland Joffe, our director, and his production team did an amazing job on the sets and the recreation of the time. I was really pleased with that.
Yeah, you don't see these kind of epics as much anymore, and even in film. I mean, this same sort of procedure that you have here, the same sort of setup. I mean, they could be $150 million movie if it was a feature film.
Yeah, absolutely, very easily. And again, I was worried because I thought, God, what's this going to look like? It's going to be, 10 horses and a mule sitting in the background. But when you watch this thing, Roland Joffe, who was a master at staging and choreography, there was always about 5 layers of background action going on at any given time. And if we were doing a 2-shot, we're talking in the tent, outside the tent, you'd see a whole world out there. And usually in these kind of things, they can only pull the trigger on that world once in a while, and then they have to kind of sequester it away and shoot it very tight. I was very impressed by that. The other thing is it's widescreen. So that's twice as much world you got to show on the screen. Most of this was done in camera. In a way, it was kind of an old approach, but to me, it's so much more organic for the viewer and for us as the actors. We were really, immersed in a whole world of Texas in 1836 because of all this great art direction.
Well, let me ask you about a couple of other projects that you've been in. We're an awards website. You mentioned Hatfields and McCoys. Last time you were at the Emmy Awards was for that. And
Yeah.
your co-stars Kevin Costner and Tom Berenger won that night. What was that night like for you?
Well, I was thrilled. I was thrilled for Kevin. He really spearheaded the thing when he came on board. I had just finished but I was a little hesitant because here was another religious patriarchal figure of Randall McCoy, and I just thought, gee, are people going to just start to think of me in these kind of religious type of roles? And I called Kevin up. I knew Kevin Costner a little bit just in passing over the years. And I said, I have a little reservation and I have another project that's kind of in front of this. And he said, oh, man, we're going to wear beards and we're going to be in Romania. He was very persuasive. And I was glad I signed up for that. And we had a great experience overseas. And I was thrilled for him. I was glad to see him get the award. I was nervous about having to get up and give a speech, but I was relieved that he got it. It was one of those things where it was pretty deep into the show, so you have to kind of, I think if you're lucky in it for something, you want that award to come up early in the show. So whether you win or lose, you can keep.
Well, I liked that Kevin won, but boy, when I watched that project, I was so impressed with what you did because I thought your character, he starts out really as such a nice guy, and events of all the stuff that happens over those years, you just, as an actor, you got to go on a real journey with this guy to a whole other place.
They called me, the director, Kevin Reynolds, had a name for me. I'm trying to think. Mr. Congeniality. The guy came back from the war. He was very bitter. He sees this, he sees Devil Anse Hatfield as someone he considered a brother, but because he supposedly deserted, he comes back. And what was in those days, the worst thing you could be was a profiteer. It's bad enough to desert, go back to your family. But a lot of soldiers did that. They just saw so much horror. They just left the battlefield. I really fault a man for that in some ways, but to come back and see a friend who's now profiteering with this lumber mill, making money misery of the war, and that really stuck in his craw. I didn't have much of a runway to go from being kind of brothers in arms to kind of hating his guts in that thing. They didn't calibrate it, so it was a pretty short runway to get that off the ground. But I had a great time, and he was super supportive of me. We all were. You know, these kind of shows are when you go off on location and you're all together, create a really unique relationship and an energy on the film, because you're all away from home and your families. You're all together. I've made some of the best friendships I've ever made in this business have been from some of these long location shoots. Certainly, I consider Kevin a good friend, and Tom Berenger. He he likes to text me once in a blue moon and give me a hard time about different things. But I love him. He's over in Beaufort, South Carolina.
And that was a great role for him. A real showcase.
He had a line where he's saying something about the profiteering. He said it's like wiping your ass with a wagon wheel. There's just no end to it.
Hey, listen, a couple of more questions. I'd asked you before we started, you're an Oscar voter, and I always, when I get an Oscar voter on, I always like to ask the same question, which is, when you've got your ballot in front of you and you're thinking over, especially in the acting categories, what gets a Bill Paxton vote? What type of performance are you looking for that makes you want to vote for them?
Well, you know, I only vote in the years where I feel I've watched enough of the movies to be informed. You know, I sometimes go for the subtler stuff. You know, the more showy, performance-oriented portrayals I like, but to me, I look for more subtle performances because I know how hard that work is to pull off. I'm trying to think what was up last year. You know, it's so funny. It's the whole world at that time. You know, everyone's talking about the Oscars, but then, God, a year later, it's hard to remember who won. Now I know Michael Keaton won. I was very excited and very supportive of him, but there were a lot of great performances last year. I thought it was a pretty great year as far as the acting categories. I was thrilled to see Lupita Nyong'o win for 12 Years a Slave. I thought that was a staggering performance, just heartbreaking. Yeah, I'm just trying to.
Once I get a few months past, I'm so, you know, after dealing with it all those months, I'm so focused on the next year. I can't even remember what was nominated or won this past year. But we had things like Boyhood this year and Birdman and Imitation Game, Theory of Everything. That's some of the ones. Oh, Julianne Moore was really, she won. So.
Oh yeah, that was a great performance.
You mentioned right before we started, you've got a couple of things coming up. One, I believe, is a feature, and one is a TV film. Just give us a quick synopsis of some things you know are on the way for you.
Well, I've got a movie coming out where I play kind of an antagonistic character. I'm out to get Vince Vaughn. I'm a dirty vice cop and Vince has something on me, and it's a thing I'm a supporting actor in that, opposite Vince and Haley Steinfeld, and that's called Term Life. It's a thriller. It's coming out, I think, in the fall. And I just finished a BBC television movie with Daniel Radcliffe. They don't really have a title right now, but it's about two characters, two real-life characters, and an incident that happened about 10 years ago where Daniel plays a guy named Sam Hauser. He started Rockstar Games and created the game Grand Theft Auto, which became one of the biggest, maybe the biggest entertainment of all time when it was released. I think in 3 days it sold $1 billion worth of games. I play a man named Jack Thompson who was an attorney at the time in Florida who, because of an incident where a young man in Alabama killed 3 police officers and said he didn't really know what he was doing. My character went to the families of the police officers and said, I believe that the people that make the games are somehow responsible and should compensate. So he filed a lawsuit against Sony, the makers of PlayStation, the machine, and Rockstar Games, the makers of Grand Theft Auto. It became a big civil suit trial. But it's an interesting piece because it's a real two-hander. You know, it's kind of an A-B story. You follow Daniel's character and you follow my character. They're kind of on a collision course. But I think it's very well leavened because it really addresses the whole issue of violence in the media. And, you know, are people infected by this enough to go out? It's hard to prove causation, but you kind of see both sides of it. You see the freedom of expression that Sam Houser, this visionary gaming guy who comes up with this whole world in this game of Grand Theft Auto, and then you see this kind of moral crusader who's saying, hey, wait a minute, this stuff's hurting our children. And you're kind of, as the audience, you're kind of put in the middle. I think it's going to be a great piece.
And that's a TV movie that'll be out roughly when?
You know, that's going to premiere, be kind of a flagship program for the BBC season this fall in England. And so I'm not sure who's going to pick it up over here, but it'll probably be on here by the end of the year.
Oh, okay, I got you. Yeah, sometimes those go to BBC America, sometimes they go to PBS, sometimes other places, but I'm sure we'll be aware of it when it hits. Just a couple more things on Texas Rising. I've got to tell you, I meant to mention earlier, I normally catch on to things pretty fast, but I had to go look on IMDb after the first 2 hours. Who is this old crazy guy? And it turned out to be Ray Liotta. I would have never guessed that was Ray Liotta. He gives a great performance in this piece.
I told Ray, I said, when people see him in this, he's going to be on horseback for the rest of his career.
He's going to be the Walter Brennan of the future, right?
Oh, he was terrific in this. He plays really a symbolic character. He's a fictional character. There were no survivors on the Texas side at the Alamo. They were either they were executed or they just weren't any. But he comes out of a pile of bodies and is this guy who's kind of bent on revenge. And I think the writers and Roland Jaffe kind of used him to symbolize kind of what war does in destroying a man's soul. And his hero's journey is that he is just living to just avenge the deaths of his family and friends. And then he has kind of epiphany by the end of the piece where he kind of finds his humanity again. It's a beautiful performance. His greatest scene in the movie to me is mostly played on his back. He's on horseback outside with Sarah Jones is a homesteader, and he's come to give her some money so she can buy. He finds out that this impresario is trying to foreclose on her, and he wants to help her. He's seen her at a church do a kindness, and he wants to give her this money. As he starts to turn his horse away, she asks him something that stops him. She asks him his name, and he hasn't even thought of his name. He's even probably forgotten his name. He's been so immersed in blood and vengeance. And he talks to her with his back to her, and I have to say that is a very, very powerful moment, and you don't even see his face. But that's the kind of scene that I go, that's an award-winning scene. That's an award-winning performance. You asked me earlier how I judge horse flesh in this business, and that's how I judge it.
Yeah, he's really good. So many in this, and you mentioned Jeremy Davies. He has I think cornered the market on this kind of crazy kind of role. He did that in Justified too, and won an Emmy a couple of years ago. He's very. I think he's sort of the comic relief at times. I really enjoy it as well.
He reminds me of myself in Aliens.
Yeah, I could see that. He takes some tips from you on that one.
No, he came fully loaded for bear. I didn't have to say anything to him except down, boy.
Back it down a little bit. Well, listen, I hope it's one of my favorite projects I've seen in the last few months. I'm really hoping that a lot of you in front of the screen and a lot of the behind the scenes folks that work so hard all get Emmy nominations, and we'll know here in about a month or so.
Well, let's hope so. Sure appreciate the interview.
Thank you very much.